Welcome to the 6-part podcast series entitled From Golden Age to Expulsion, The History, Society, and Culture of Medieval Sephardic Jews. I'm Benjamin Gampel, and over the next 6 sessions, we're going to take a wonderful trip, starting from the origins of Sephardic Jewry in the distant mists of time, through the most famous expulsion of the Jews from a Western European country, the expulsion of the Jews from Castile and Aragon, Portugal and Navarre, over the course of the last decade of the 15th century. But where should we begin in this wonderful journey about this Jewish community whose reputation and whose cultural production still resonate with us today? Let's take a look at a map of the Iberian Peninsula, which, as you see today, is occupied by Spain and Portugal. And the first question that we want to ask ourselves as we begin this journey through the history of Sephardic Jews is, when do the first Jews arrive in the Iberian Peninsula? Well, the first evidence that we have of the Jews in what today is Spain and Portugal is a record of Jews through their tombstones, which indicate that there was a Jewish population in the peninsula in the years in which the Roman Empire ruled Iberia. In fact, the first evidence that we have is of a tombstone of a little girl who sadly died at the age of 1 year and 4 months, whose tombstone, written in Latin, indicates that indeed she is a young Jewish girl. Her name, Anna Salomonula. But one thing, before we begin with the actual history of the Jews within this far western corner of the Roman Empire, is to maybe spend a couple of minutes talking about the myths that the Jews who lived within this peninsula possessed about their origins. Because what we're going to see is that the myths that sometimes the people maintain about themselves is in of itself of great interest and reveals much about the culture of that people. The Jews of the Iberian Peninsula centuries later imagined that their community did not begin with the Roman Empire, but indeed, as I said before, was dated way back, shrouded in the hoary mists of time, centuries and centuries beforehand. They imagined that King Solomon, of biblical fame, had sent one of his tax collectors across the Mediterranean to collect monies from people who lived in the western corner of the Mediterranean. And there were other myths as well, that the Jews in the first century of the Common Era had already established their own community in the center of the peninsula, in the city of Toledo. What these myths tell us, and frankly, they're also similar to the myths that Jews possess, even today in America, about the first communities, the first Jews arriving with the Western explorers who first placed their toes, if you will, in the sands outside of our continent. That what it does indicate to us is that the Jews of Iberia, of today's Spain and Portugal, like to imagine that their community dated back to the very beginnings of human population in this area. That means that they like to imagine that they were fully integrated in the life and culture of their surroundings from the very beginning. No, they were not newcomers, they were not immigrants, but rather they imagined themselves to be an integral element of the society in which they later came to live. But the reality, as we do know, is that probably the Jews came to Iberia with the Roman Empire. Jews were to be found wherever the Roman Empire spread. From England in the north, or to their eastern borders in the Middle East today. Those were all parts of the Roman Empire, and Jews were to be found in every one of those areas. In fact, it's interesting that in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, when attempting to spread Christianity throughout the cities and towns of Rome and of its empire, the Apostle Paul intended to visit Spain. And we know something about Paul, that Paul generally visited communities in order to sway them to Christianity. He usually chose those communities where there already was a Jewish population. A good hint possibly to us that already in Spain, during the time of the Apostle Paul, during the first century, the Jews already could have boasted a significant community. The first time we have evidence that we can speak about comfortably of large groups of Jews dates from the 4th century of the Common Era. Here we need to imagine that we're still in the Roman Empire, but something has changed. Because over the course of the 4th century, Christianity is going to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. A truly significant change which starts with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. Here now, we look in on Roman Spain. We look in on Roman Spain in the first decade of the 4th century, where we have our first written evidence of a Jewish community. What I've brought for you today is a wonderful book, Amnon Linder's edited volume, The Jews and the Legal Sources of the Early Middle Ages. And here, what I find on page 482 is a wonderfully interesting text. What I have here in this volume is evidence of the first church council which ever met. This church council met in Iliberis, which is near the modern city of Granada. If we cut to the map, we'll be able to see Granada right here, and the town of Iliberis was right near the modern city of Granada. But in the town of Iliberis, local churchmen from the Iberian Peninsula, from Roman Spain, gathered together to discuss issues of crucial import to them. And over the more than 70 items of legislation passed by this council, fascinatingly, there are 4 that directly connect to the Jewish population. So, let me read to you from Amnon Linder's transcription of the Roman Church Council that took place in Iliberis, approximately, it says here, 306. And I quote, "If heretics should refuse to cross over to the Catholic Church, Catholic maidens shall not be given to them." In other words, what the church members are deciding in the early 4th century is that Catholic girls should not be married to heretics. Heretics meant Christians who did not follow what was believed then to be the true ideas and values of Christianity. But the paragraph continues, "And it was resolved to give them neither to Jews nor to heretics, because no association could exist between the faithful and the infidel." That's a wonderfully interesting law, that Catholic girls should not be allowed to marry heretics, but not be allowed to marry Jews. At this point, we need to pause, and we need to ask ourselves about legislation in general. If churchmen are gathering together in southern Spain, and they're deciding to legislate that no Catholic girls should marry either heretics or Jews, it wouldn't be far afield for us to suggest that these laws were not made in a vacuum, but directed primarily against the social reality. The social reality, therefore, may have been that these Catholic girls were given in marriage to both heretics and to Jews. Now, if I may add, if those Jews or those heretics would refuse to marry Catholic girls, then there would have been no need for this conciliar legislation. What it might indicate to us is that, at least in some cases, Catholics and heretics mixed and mixed in marriage, and so did Catholics and Jews. Quite striking. How did Jews view Christians and Christians view Jews in the early 4th century? Well, we'll continue reading. The law continues. It is resolved that if parents should act contrary to this interdiction, they shall be removed for 5 years. Wow, that adds another fascinating layer. It's not that Jews and Christians would simply meet each other and then decide to get married, maybe as a result of their social interaction, but parents are instructed not to marry their Catholic girls to Jewish men. That means the parents of Catholics and the parents of Jews had decided that it might have been a good idea for economic reasons or for social reasons to link their families in marriage. Wow, that takes our breath away. Does that mean in the early 4th century, Jews and Christians might have imagined themselves as much closer to each other than we normally would think about when we think about the Middle Ages or even up through modern times? But there's another detail that we need to focus upon. Catholic girls are forbidden to marry Jewish men. Why doesn't it say Catholic men can't marry young Jewish women? We learned something. What we learn is that probably the women followed the religion and the religious community of the man whom they married. So yes, Catholic men might marry Jewish girls because then, according to the bishops, those Catholic men would take those Jewish women under their wing, and the Jewish women would be subsumed under their family. But they were fearful about Catholic girls. If they would marry Jewish men, they then would be lost to the church, and they would join the Jewish community. A fascinating window and insight from this law. Let's continue. I read again from Linder's transcription and translation of the conciliar legislation at Iliberis. By the way, for those of you who would like to know where that is, as I said, it's outside of Granada, and the Spanish town is called Elvira. Let's look at another canon. Canon number 49. I must tell you, canon number 49 is one that I've spent much time thinking about. A bit complicated, but let's read it together. It was resolved to warn the landowners that they should not suffer that their fruits which they received with thanksgiving from God shall be blessed by Jews, lest they make our blessing null and void. If anyone should unlawfully presume to do so, subsequent to this interdiction, he shall be utterly expelled from the church. So what does this law mean? A little bit difficult to listen to carefully as I was reading it. If it was resolved that landowners should not suffer rather that their fruits which they receive with the thanksgiving from God be blessed by the Jews. We have to imagine that Christian landowners in southern Iberia and what today is southern Spain would have their crops blessed by Jews. That means that these Christian landowners and agricultural folks from time immemorial have always been concerned about the success of their crops. That these landowners, concerned about that their crops should come in well and there should be a wonderfully full and rich harvest, would ask Jews to come and bless their crops for them. But the reality is even more complicated, because the law said, if anyone should unlawfully presume to do so, our blessing will be null and void. That means we have to imagine Christian landowners first going to the church and getting a blessing for their crops, and then seeking a blessing from the Jews. Oh, let's not smirk to ourselves and imagine that this is an ancient case of wearing a belt and suspenders. But rather what we should imagine is that Christians lived with Jews and Jews with Christians. And when farmers concerned about their crops did hasten to the church to get the church's blessing, they were also aware of the Jews in their midst. And that the Jews in their midst also had rituals whereupon crops would be blessed, and maybe that their harvest would come in so fully that they indeed would be quite satisfied. But again, like we said earlier about the marriage of Jews and Christians, there would be no need for this legislation if the Jews, when called upon to bless the crops of the Christians, would refrain, would say, "Oh, I'd love to bless your crops, but I know you're Christian. Please, why don't you attend to the local church where you could receive the blessings from the local clergyman?" But rather what the Jews must have responded was, "Sure, I'm happy to come and bless your crops." And now, back to the law. If anyone should unlawfully presume to do so, he shall be utterly expelled from the church. Now, careful listeners might remember that for marrying off your girl, your Catholic girl, to a Jewish man, you received an interdiction of 5 years. How about for crop blessing? Altogether expelled from the church. How are we to understand this? Your Christian girl marrying a Jewish man, 5 years. Getting a blessing from a particular spiritual Jew, expelled from the church. I think we're onto something now. The local churchmen in the early 4th century are aware that Jews and Christians are mixing. That maybe in a pagan environment, these monotheistic groups found much in common. There were indications that Jewish men and Catholic women were married. We don't know how, and we don't know under what religious dispensation. And the churchmen were aware as well that Christian farmers would often go off to Jews and have them bless their crops. What this indicates to the church that's attempting very, very deliberately in the early 4th century to grow a community of Christians which will be proud and clearly understanding of their heritage, that their religion can stand proud now in the late Roman Empire. They were concerned. They were concerned that if there was too much mixing, both in terms of marital ties, but especially when it comes to religious matters, to the blessing of crops, that the Christians would look toward Jews. That would undermine the faith. And what the Christian clergymen are saying is, you need to choose. If you choose the Jews' blessings, you're altogether rejected from the church. But what does that tell us about the Jews? That the Jews lived in southern Spain, were probably landowners, lived alongside Christians and others, and they mixed easily and well with them. Now for the next law. It was resolved that if indeed any cleric or faithful should take food with Jews, he shall be removed from communion in order to make him amend. Clerics are not permitted to take food with Jews. Clerics mean clergymen. Clergymen should not take food with Jews. Now, if I may say so humorously, does that mean that the local bishops or priests would often go out with a Jewish neighbor for a tuna melt, maybe, in the local diner? I think not. We have evidence from other parts of the Roman Empire that clerics, Christian clergymen, often attended ritual meals which Jews held. Oh, Christian clergymen came to Sabbath meals, came to meals on holidays. And remember, it takes two. It takes two with marriages, it takes two with crop blessing, and with meals as well. That means Jewish families would invite Christian clerics, and Christian clerics would be glad to attend. And you know how Jewish ritual meals begin, with a blessing on the bread, and first a blessing on the wine. The only two rituals that the Catholic Church took from Judaism, and as we well know, transformed it into the Eucharist, into the celebration of the Eucharist, of the body and blood of Christ. Here there are Christian clergymen eating with Jews. And what the local church council, attempting to create a certain unity among the Christian population, declares that that simply can't be countenanced anymore. The last of the four items, the four church councils at Elvira, talks about if any one of the faithful with a wife should commit adultery with a Jewess or with a Gentile, he shall be kept away from communion. If he should be exposed by another man, he shall be allowed to join the Lord's communion after he has completed a 5-year regular penance. Are we saying here that Christian men only committing adultery with a Jewess or a Gentile shall be kept away from communion? Surely adultery wasn't allowed with Christian women as well. Yes, that's true. Christian men were specifically told not to have adultery with a Jewess or a pagan. And let me explain why. We saw beforehand that Christian men, if they wished to marry Jewish women, that the church did not see any reason to object, because that woman would be subsumed in the Christian family and the children as well. The concern here with adultery is outside of the normal moral strictures that the Christians and the Jews had. The concern here was that sex between a Christian man and a Jewish woman might indeed result in a child. And because there was no marriage, that child would be lost to the church. It's precisely because of the lack of legal ties that the child would remain with the mother, and in this particular case, either be brought up as a Jew or brought up as a pagan. What we've seen over the course of the conciliar legislation at Iliberis, and this is just one small window into this culture, is that the Jews in the late Roman Empire in the 4th century seem to have been well integrated into the surroundings. They probably were farmers as well. There is additional evidence that the Jews lived in cities. And in fact, we see the early church, if anything, concerned precisely about the integration of Christians and Jews. And in fact, what we know about the Jews in the Roman Empire generally sheds a somewhat parallel light on what we have just discovered took place in the Iberian Peninsula. So our first window onto the history of Iberian Jews indicates a Jewish community integrated into this environment, comfortable with its neighbors, and seemingly representing, I would say, the economic activities that were present in the general population.